open up your Bibles to the book of Leviticus right at the very beginning, and we're going to get started talking a little bit about this. This goes from Leviticus chapter 1:1 to Leviticus 6:7. Unless you have a Hebrew copy of the Bible, it goes to 5:26, I think. The Hebrew version, this is where the Hebrew and the English versions go all wonky. So here we move forward, and I want to say Vayikra is a very different and powerful book. It is the book of holiness. We have spoken with each other several times about holiness and what holiness is. The book of Leviticus describes for us what is it that is holiness, and how to approach God, and what type of behavior He expects from His people. What type of behaviors will defile them. What types of things that they can do to reestablish that connection with God, to get purified of a spiritual, if you will, infection, if you want to call it that. I think, as you can see on the top of the page here, I like to say that Vayikra is about worship and atonement, but you notice that I put at one ment. How do you become at one with God? That's what this is all about. Now, a couple of preliminary remarks. What happened since last time? Well, last time we were in the end, and we didn't get an opportunity to meet I don't believe it was related to coronavirus. It might have been the last time. That was the end of the book of Exodus. And during the last couple of chapters of the book of Exodus was them. You remember that we got together and we read a few weeks back regarding the materials and the instructions for how to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. And during the last couple of chapters of Exodus, you actually had them begin to build the wilderness tabernacle. And at the very end of the book of Exodus, if you can just flip back one page and you'll see it, it says that the Spirit of God, the Shekinah glory of God, came down into this tent, possibly around it in the whole area, and overwhelmed the place with His cloud of glory. Was so intense that they couldn't even go near the tent. And I think that what's an interesting idea and visual that you want to pull from that is that God, the way that God is coming down from heaven first to the top of Mount Sinai to commune with Moshe and give him the instructions, but He's still making a little journey between heaven and earth in order, figuratively, obviously, to communicate with Moses. But now that He said, I want you to build this place so that I may dwell among, and that Hebrew word can also be translated as in. I want to dwell among and in my people. And so the tent gets filled with the Shekinah glory of God. It is exactly as He has described. He is now dwelling with His people. And then God begins to speak from inside the tent. And He gives Moses some instructions for the priest. So God begins to speak from among the people with instructions for the priests. And these instructions come in several categories and several different sets of instructions. But today, we're dealing with the first 5 chapters, or 6 if you're counting. How do we approach Yuvah, in worship, to draw close to him. There's a couple of offerings. This is sacrifices. This is what the whole first part of the book of Leviticus is about, is these sacrifices. Now, I'm going to just lay them out for you briefly, with just only minor details thrown out there, because we're going to dig a little bit deeper into them in just a few. But I'm just going to throw these out there to you first. So the first set of instructions is, how do you approach God in worship through these sacrifices? The first type of sacrifice that is mentioned right off the bat in chapter 1 is the olah. This means going up. You've heard the term aliyah or I don't remember the name of their airline, but they've got an airline over there that is, going up. So olah means to go up. That is the first type of offering. The second one is mincha. This is kind of like a tribute or a pledge of allegiance, kind of. That is not an animal sacrifice. That is a grain offering. And then there's the shelamim, which is the third type of offering. This is a peace or goodwill covenantal type of offering. And then it's our second category, which is how to reestablish broken fellowship or remove uncleanness that has been contracted. And there are two sacrifices, if you want to call them that are in this category. The first one is the shata'ah shagaga, which is a fantastic word. You should say that a few times. And this is the type of sacrifice that you offer if you missed the mark on accident. You were shooting for the bullseye, and your arrow fully bounced off of someone's helmet and went flying off somewhere else. And then the asham, which is a payment for guilt or a purification. It's a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a moment. So those are the 5 types of sacrificial offerings. Now, there's one other sacrificial offering, or actually, I'm not going to limit it to that. You've heard that there are libation offerings where you pour out drink on the altar up there. Can anybody think of another one that is not part of this list? One of them would be the daily offering. I know that you guys have heard about the daily offering, the ones that are done at 9 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon every single day. The mincha and the shacharit, I believe they are called. And then the Pesach, the Passover, is also one of the offerings. It's not exactly an offering, though. Pesach is a little different. But those are if you want to call them animal sacrifices, but they're not all animal sacrifices. So these 5 categories right here, olah, mincha, shalamim, shata'ah, shagaga, and asham, are the 5 main types of offerings. I don't want to call them sacrifices because they're not all sacrifices. Those are the 5 types. And you will see these repeated periodically throughout the remainder of our study in the book of Leviticus. Now, I want to ask a couple of important questions. I know that you have heard, and I have too many times, is there not in there, is there an offering for willful, rebellious, or high-handed sins in the Torah? Because some people will tell you that, the only way you're getting your sin forgiven by offering some kind of an animal is if there is, if the sin was unintentional. You can't get an intentional sin forgiven in the Torah. Have you heard that before? Anyone?
I think so. I think we heard it from you.
You have probably, yes, you have heard it from me. I have said that on a few occasions myself. And, I will tell you that there's some confusion about that, frankly. And I think I may have been wrong, and I have been wrong many, many times, and I thank you for being gracious to me in regards to it. But I will say this. There are many rabbis who will tell you that there is no offering that you can make for a willful sin. And there are many Hebrew roots teachers who will tell you the same thing. I hear it all the time, and I've said it myself. But I got to tell you, if any of you guys have read this Torah portion, and I hope that you have, you'll see what I'm talking about. If you read this week, you're looking at yourself and you're scratching your head and you're saying, wait a minute. I have heard that there is no offering that can be made for willful sin. But there's some straight up stuff in this section that'll just blow that right out of the water potentially. That's one thing that you got to think about. Anybody have any comments about that?
Are you going to read your report too?
I will, yes, in a little bit. I will deal with it, yes. But I also put a note here of, this is a section from the Talmud called Keratot 9a, verse 14, deals with this. You can find this on Sephariah if you're familiar with that software and how to look up the Talmudic stuff if you want to. But you're going to find a mix of opinions. There are a bunch of rabbis who will tell you absolutely no. There's nothing you can do for a willful sin. And okay, you know what, Tracy? I think I don't mind at all just jumping ahead a little bit and going over to Leviticus chapter 6 in an English Bible. If you've got a complete Jewish Bible or from the Jewish Publication Society or something, that's going to be at the end of chapter 5, rather. But I'll read to you chapter 6. It's only the first 7 verses in an English Bible. It says, Yehovah spoke to Moshe, saying, when a soul sins and offends with an offense against Yehovah and dissimulates, that is, lies, or swears falsely, against his companion in regard to committing, or pledge of hand or pillage. This is a horrible translation. I apologize. I'm changing. Going back to verse 2, when any soul sins and commits a trespass against Yehovah and has lied to his neighbor about a deposit or about a pledge or about a robbery, or shall extort from his neighbor, or has found what was lost and has lied concerning it, and did swear falsely, so that he sins in regard to any one of all these things that a man does, then it shall be when he sins and shall be guilty, that he shall return what he took by robbery, or what he has extorted, or the deposit which was deposited with him, or the lost item which he found, all that about which he swore falsely. He shall repay its total value, add 1/5 more to it, and give it to whom it belongs on the day of his guilt offering. Then he brings his guilt offering to Yehovah, a ram, a perfect one from the flock, with your valuation, as a guilt offering to the priest. And the priest shall make atonement for him before Yehovah, and he shall be forgiven for whatever he did that made him guilty. Now, if that is not willful, I don't know how you can lie and cheat and say, oh, I don't remember having your stuff. Or you didn't give me any money to hold for you, or, oh no, I'm not going to testify because I didn't actually see that. These things that are listed here, I don't think you can do any of these accidentally. Does anyone, somebody's unmuting themselves. They're fired up. Let's hear it.
I see a connection with all of these sins going back to Esau.
Speak.
If you look at Esau, there were 2 goats that were used to trick the father and to give him a blessing to Jacob, and to make him certain that Jacob received the birthright and the blessing that comes with it.
Excellent observation.
and I connect that to Yom Kippur when there's one goat that goes out in the desert and doesn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's God showing that I'm even willing to forgive Esau.
Mm. Yeah, go ahead.
About Edom coming back in the future. Is there prophecies about Esau, Edom, and Israel reconciling in the future?
That is yes, that is my understanding. That is my understanding. Yes. There's also prophecies about great judgment on Edom, and I know that we've talked about this before. That to Jews, you people who are Gentile Christians, you are Edom. That's how they see you. That's a tricky one. But does anyone see any issue here? Because I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, and I'm testifying to you now that I don't know what to make of this, because I hear all kinds of Torah teachers, Messianic and otherwise, well-respected rabbis. Jonathan Sacks, the Lord Rabbi of England, former head chief rabbi of England, said the same thing. That there's no sacrifice you can make for willful sin, willful disobedience. And I am certain that there's a way to make this scripture disappear regarding a sin that you could commit willingly.
When you look at Yom Kippur, when that goat was being led out of the city, people hurled curses at it. They used harsh language, and they damned that goat. And it says in Scripture that it clearly deals with sin of which a person has consciously chosen to commit.
Yeah. You know, you bring up an excellent point, Jimmy, and that is regarding Yom Kippur. That's one that gives some people fits. And it's also directly connected with the book of Hebrews, which, when we get there, that's in this book, and we're going to be studying it. That's one of the things that we're going to be tripping over when we get to it, is this Yom Kippur thing, because there's a bunch of dissension in the ranks of both Messianics and Orthodox rabbis about whether Yom Kippur is actually a sacrifice that will take care of, so to speak, willful disobedience. Now, one thing I will absolutely say is that two things. Number one, it's absolutely irrelevant what you think about sin and how it should be taken care of and what types of things should be done to clear it out of the way. We have lots of ideas about that, but I'm telling you that I think we've got to dig deep and we've got to understand, and I think that's what's important about the book of Leviticus, to really get a handle as best we can on this book, because it's so related to Yeshua. You know, Yeshua being a sacrifice for sin, which we hear so much about in New Covenant language, in the church especially, that we've really got to get a handle on this and sort this out. I mean, what is it exactly that is related to the book of Leviticus and the sacrificial system that Yeshua came along and fulfilled? Because I know that we've heard, many of us, that Yeshua came and did away with the sacrifices. Well, yes, I am, Mike.
I'm wondering if maybe some of the confusion, because I agree, when you look at the Day of Atonement and the verbiage that's around those sacrifices, it doesn't really delineate willful versus ignorant sin. It just says all sin.
Right.
And I wonder if some of the confusion is around the sacrifices seem to be kind of like you were talking about around the temple and purification.
I've muted myself.
Versus like restitution and penalty for sin. Is that where some of the confusion comes in? That a lot of our modern day thought about sin and forgiveness, there's really not a lot of restitution applied. Whereas in the Torah, we're talking about, paying tenfold or death penalty. And the sacrifice might be more around purification, about how close you can actually get to God. And that's what the Messiah has done, is allowed that forgiveness and purification so we can approach.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic insight, Mikey. And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you guys tonight, is the idea. It's a little deeper, but I absolutely agree with Mikey that the sacrifices, I think it's fair to say that when you get into some of the deeper commentaries regarding the sacrificial system, you're not talking about removing sin so much as you are either covering it or making a restoration of relationship, and that the actual forgiveness of sin. And I think that this is one of the caveats that rabbis would talk about, and that is in order to perhaps get around this passage that we just read about, which is none of these sacrifices takes away sin per se, although the text does seem to say that. There is a possibility that what we're looking at is not the forgiveness of sin, but the restoration of the relationship, and and the cleansing from the damaging effects upon the relationship that sin has wrought in your life. And that these sacrifices are more about purification of the spirit to bring you back into fellowship. And your sin is you're gonna have to trust in God and have faith, just like David did in Psalm 51 that we spoke about earlier, when he cheated on his wife. Cheated on his wife. Yes, of course. He took another man's wife, killed the dude. Those are things. Those are sins that come with the death penalty. There's certainly no sacrifice that you can make in the Torah for certain sins, and that much is abundantly clear. We're talking about blasphemy and false worship, and we're talking about adultery, murder, these types of things. No, you're not. There is no sacrifice that's going to rectify that. So we have to trust in God, just like David did, to say, if there was a sacrifice that I could give that would take care of this, I would do it. But there's not. So it's a matter of trust. And as Mikey said, the sacrificial system that you're looking at here is actually a way of cleansing the spirit and removing the barrier, so to speak, that enables you to commune with God in some sense. Does that seem fair about what you were saying, Mikey?
Yeah, that's what I was aiming at.
That is, I do believe that that's true. I don't know the intricacies of this. I will tell you that this is a challenging book. This is a very challenging book. I think there's wonderful things that we can learn in here, but I will tell you that this is a very challenging book, and that we're going to struggle with it. And I encourage you to struggle with it. It's beyond... Yes, sir.
Yeah, just something to say about willful sin. We've got plenty of examples in the Old Testament of the Hebrews engaging in willful sin, and we see what God expects from them. He doesn't ask for sacrifices; He asks for them to repent, maybe sackcloth and ashes, turning around, turning 180, repentance. So even in the Old Testament,
the only thing Yahweh asks for them when they're in willful sin is to stop and to get into repent completely. And so far as the sacrificial system is concerned, God shows several times in the Old Testament He does not need our grain. He doesn't need, doves. He doesn't need any of these things. So the argument could probably be made that the sacrificial system is much more for us than it is for the Father, and that it has something to do with our own psychology. When we have to sacrifice something, it changes changes our attitude.
I would agree with you, Nathan. I think that that's a good insight, and I think having something. I mean, there's so many wonderful pictures of the Messiah Yeshua that are brought into play here. Having to experience psychologically, as Nathan has suggested, the death of a critter to expiate this barrier that is between myself and God. Yeah, that does something to the human psyche, and I would presume that it probably would deepen the sense of guilt and shame, and yet in some inexplicable way, perhaps remove it. I don't know. That's a mysterious thing for sure.
Can I say something really weird?
I would be surprised if it wasn't weird.
Caveat emptor. This is pure Jimbo here.
Take it with a grain of salt.
Buyer beware. In my opinion, if I was going to get stoned to death for murder, if I said, "Yep, I deserve this," get my last moment, get my last court of last resorts or whatever you call it.
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Nope, I did it. I deserve it. You guys chuck some big rocks at me. I deserve this." Then I think if anybody were to do it that way, then they would be their own. There wouldn't be a sacrifice for them, but by accepting the fact that God's justice is good, that they would be welcomed on the other side, and God would say, "Yeah, you paid for that sin. How you doing?" I don't know, but I think that might be the way it works.
That's a good insight. Yeah, I don't see anything totally whacked out with that.
And I think that David had to have known he was sinning against God when he committed adultery with his neighbor's wife. He had to have known that sending him to be killed would be a sin against God. Yet he still called the righteous king, and all other kings were compared to him. He had a humble heart of repentance. So there has to be something more to it that we just don't understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Totally agree.
I also agree. Excuse me, Alan?
Yes?
Yeah, so I didn't want to just barge in. This is Wayne. I think there's been a lot of good insight, and it just all hones in onto the scripture that says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Like Yeshua was the ultimate sacrifice for the remission of sins, to remove sins. But I believe people in those days, like how if we do something willfully wrong, we get down on our knees. We don't all tear our garments, but we ask for forgiveness from straight to the Father. And I believe they pretty much did the same. It's like when Yeshua was comparing the Pharisee and the tax collector in the synagogue, and he was saying, who is going to gain more favor with the Father? The Pharisee that was talking about praising himself, or the tax collector that said, "God have mercy on me, a sinner." Mm-hmm. So I do believe they went directly to God, but it was Yeshua that his death removed the sin from them. I do believe they got forgiveness if they went directly to them, but it was Yeshua's blood that was shed for the remission of sins. I think that's the only main difference. I do believe they got on their knees and cried out, "Abba, Father."
Yeah, absolutely.
I absolutely agree.
Who's agreeing?
Tammy.
Tammy? We haven't heard from you all night.
I know. I'm just quiet, but I agree with that. Absolutely.
Good.
It's Tammy.
It's Tammy.
And me too.
Who's me?
Hello.
Is that Marie? I thought that was Marie. We got a bunch of church mice out there tonight. That's okay. No, I'm delighted. And that was an excellent. Angela has made a note to me here. It says, "It wouldn't surprise me if Yeshua echoes all those sacrifices in his life/death. I would fully anticipate that that is true. That all of these sacrifices that we're going to be reading about are in some way, shape, or form echoed in the life of the Messiah. 100% agree with that. Are Bobby and Judah still with us? I don't know. Somebody's got some jams going. I don't know what that is. They may be having some audio trouble. Just checking in on everybody. Who have we not heard from? Is everybody alive out there? Just checking. Is there somebody we haven't heard from that we need to hear from? Okay. Good enough. Just touching base.
Yeah, you haven't heard from me.
Who is that, Gerald?
Yeah, that's me.
Hello, Gerald.
Yeah, and while I got you, I'd like to say something on this
Please do.
simple thing we're talking about. Christ said all sin can be forgiven man except the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. So from my way of thinking, anything that you do, whether it's willful or non-willful, can be forgiven, according to Yeshua. And then if you go over to Hebrews 10, it talks about, I interpret it that as a person has been saved, or a person has heard that Yeshua is the Savior, and he decides that that is not sufficient to forgive his sins, then there's no hope for this guy. If he rejects Christ and the blood, basically he's blaspheming the Holy Spirit and saying what Christ did wasn't sufficient, and that person's not going to be forgiven. There's no sacrifice for sin. There's no more sacrifice for sin for him.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing you can do aside from trusting in God, in the sacrificing of His own Son to have these sins expiated. There's nothing else you can do. So if you ain't getting your forgiveness from Him through the sacrificial death of His Son, you ain't getting forgiveness, period. Now, I know that many of us have thought about and discussed the idea that, these sacrifices are coming back in the millennial kingdom. And who knows about after that? We don't really have a bunch of information about what happens after that. But we certainly know that during the millennial period, apparently, according to Ezekiel and a couple of other prophets, that this sacrificial system is coming back. Now that has always struck people as quite weird, that the sacrificial system would come back. And I think that this speaks to some of the issues that I started addressing in my presentation, which is that we have a lot of, and I'm going to go back to my presentation here just for a moment, that we have a lot of weird ideas. Most Christian teachers, woefully mischaracterize the teachings of the rabbis regarding sacrifices. I mean, I know that I heard, and I know you probably did too, that Jews relied on the sacrifices to take away their sins. Now, I cannot find anything in the rabbinic writings from the first century that seems to indicate that. Jews do not believe that sins were taken away by the sacrificial system. Almost every Jew that you'll talk to will tell you that is simply not the case. But that's what we heard growing up as normal everyday Christians, that Jews believed that their sins were taken care of by this sacrificial system, and that when Jesus died on the cross and they lost their temple in 70 A.D., well, they're all going to hell now because they got no more sacrificial system to take care of their sins, and they refuse to believe in Jesus, so all Jews are going to hell. Who's talking?
This is Tracy.
Speak it.
Paul was a Jew, and I'm assuming, although I shouldn't assume, he wrote Hebrews. But let's just say a Hebrew or Jew wrote it. But in chapter 10, verse 4, he says, it is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins.
Yes. Yes.
So whoever wrote this seemed to understand that.
Yep. I agree. And I think, so, back to what we talked about previously, regarding, are there sacrifices to take away sins? Well, in a sense, yes, but in a sense, no. And I think that what Mike was saying earlier about, this is not really about the sin at all, but about somehow allowing the worshiper to get over himself and overcome this barrier and reconnect with God, and that the sin is going to have to be taken on faith, that God is going to expiate this sin in some way, shape, or form. And I think that that's the issue that First Peter is talking about when it says that the Spirit in them, these people of old, was signifying about the Messiah, that they didn't know what was going to happen. They were looking forward. They had faith in God just like we do, that we are looking backwards. Peter tells us that we now know the person and the time that the Spirit in them was predicting. We now can look back in history and see what God has done, and as at that time, they had to just trust in God to take away their sins without seeing what He was going to do to take care of it. They didn't have historical perspective. So, in fact, the Bible tells us that blessed is the one who believes without seeing. So it's frankly, we've got it a little bit easier than they do, because we can look back at what God has done with the Messiah Yeshua to take away our sins. But they had to just trust in faith that these sacrifices were going to, I don't even want to call them a patchwork to somehow gloss over the issue until such a time as Yeshua came to take care of this issue. But it's certainly possible that is a decent way to look at it. I don't know that I want to do that, though, because I believe that, especially in regards to the first three offerings that you see with my screen sharing up there, which is the Olah, the Mincha, and the Shalamim. Those are not about sin at all. And we'll talk about those in a moment. But I think it's entirely relevant to look at what exactly these people thought, and looking forward into history, into the time period ahead of them, and saying, what is God going to do to take care of my sins? All I can do is trust Him. I can make this sacrifice for my guilt and my purification, so to speak, to enable me to try to get over my guilt and my shame, and enable me to somehow enjoy some type of fellowship with God and reconnect with Him, because I have a repentant spirit and a repentant heart, and I want to reconnect. But I'm going to have to trust in God for how He's going to take care of that, because He hasn't given me any instructions in the Torah regarding how I can get this bulk of my sin out of the way. And I don't mind telling you that I don't have a whole lot of unintentional sin in my life. I don't know about you guys, but I don't have a whole lot of unintentional sins. My sins are fully intentional. I don't want to do them, but I just keep stumbling over them. And I know that I'm just like you guys. I seem to keep stumbling over the same ones over and over and over. I don't want to say that to that person when I should be more gracious or more forgiving. Or, my problem is certainly not with unintentional sin. Yes, there are times when I sin when I totally didn't mean to, and I just missed the mark entirely. But my sins, those are the ones that I know I shouldn't, but I do anyway. Those are the ones I'm dealing with. So I've got to rely on Yeshua to take care of this for me, or I'm in big trouble. Angela has passed another note to me. Well, of course it's fairly patently obvious that I'm reading your notes.
Well, say it
I say it like I meant. Yeah. I'm not going to pretend that this is for me because I have to read it. Sorry, my wife's wanting to get her 2 cents in without acting like she actually said it. Sacrifices were instructive about Yeshua's sacrifice that would be effective if fully restoring the created to the Creator. So Leviticus is instructive of Yeshua being effective. Okay, I like what you're putting down. Would you like to make another comment? You can come close and speak a little further. She's refusing to get anywhere near this camera. Would you guys like to see Angela?
No.
Come on, Angela. Come and see.
Of course we would. Come on, you fans.
She's not going to do it. That's okay. I'm going to move forward just a little bit because we ain't making a whole lot of headway. But what would I expect? That's okay. This is working just like it normally does. Are you guys still seeing my notes here? Am I still presenting? Okay, good deal. All right, good deal. So I'm going to actually read a small portion of the very intro to the book of Leviticus and make some comments about this that I want you to consider. Fascinating stuff. Are you ready? Leviticus chapter 1, starting in verse 1 and just going through verse 4. The tent is set up. The glory of God comes in. And then Yehovah begins to speak to Moses. And Yehovah called to Moses and spoke to him out of the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you offers an oblation," it's a weird word, that is the Hebrew word korban, "to Yehovah, you will offer your oblation of the cattle, even of the herd and of the flock," speaking broadly. "If his oblation," different Hebrew word, olah, "be a burnt offering," korban, "of the herd, he will offer it a male without blemish. He will offer it at the door of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted, ratzon, before Yehovah. And he will lay his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted for him to make atonement, kafar, for him." Now, I deliberately brought forth these Hebrew words in this text because they're so critical to understanding what's going on in this section here. And I want to bring your attention to each of them in order. Number 1, in verse 2, it says that whenever any man of you offers an oblation. Now, this is olah. Now, I want to point out that olah / korban, there are 2 words here, olah and korban, which are variously translated in your Bibles as offering, sacrifice, oblation. You might have a couple of different other synonyms in there, but there are 2 different Hebrew words here. And the first one is korban. Now that is a fascinating word, and it is believed by many linguists that the word korban is where you come up with the word carbon. Now, I know that those of you who remember a little bit of your science classes will know that carbon is simply an element. I don't even know if it's an element. It's kind of something that happens. Excuse me, Angela?
It's an element.
What's that?
It's an element.
It is an element. Yeah, of course it is. That basically it's charcoal. Carbon is something that you get when you take something that is one substance and you apply great heat to it. It changes its chemical nature and structure to where it actually becomes carbon. It becomes carbonized, something that has great heat or pressure applied to it. Organic matter or inorganic matter is turned into carbon or charcoal. Now, this is fascinating when you think of this, and this is what is offered. This is what is often referred to as a whole burnt offering, because the offering is completely consumed by fire. Now, I know that there's a little bit of difference here, but I just wanted to point out to you that carbon and korban are linked. And I think the fascinating thing to me about this is that carbon is, if you think about it from the perspective of charcoal, what does charcoal do? Well, it's a substance that was formerly in one state that was, because of the refining fire, it had its complete nature changed. And it now is a different substance altogether. And what its purpose is to take on the flame of the source and give off light and heat itself. Do you see the strange spiritual picture that is arising here from the korban, the carbon, a whole burnt offering? That is what, and remember that this offering has absolutely nothing to do with sin. This is a voluntary offering where a person wants to go up. This is the other Hebrew word, olah, which means to go up. So this, when a person wants to ascend, to have communion with God, he takes an animal and he offers it on the altar as a whole burnt offering, almost as a physical representation of a spiritual reality, which is, I want to wholly subsume myself in you, have my complete nature changed so that I may take on your characteristics and burn with your passion, with your heat, with your light. This is the essence, the purest essence of worship of God. A heart that is just sold out to God and wants to come and make an offering out of the depths of his heart to connect with God. He wants to go up. I feel like I'm talking to no one. I know this is a little bit weird, but it's critical when you're talking to people in a room that you're getting both visual and non-visual cues from your audience. Some of them are usually going to sleep or nodding their heads or smiling or something. Would anyone care to comment on this? Let me know that I've not been disconnected or something.
I'm here.
Well, thank you. You have proven that I'm not talking to the empty Intertron.
I've been listening.
Excellent. Do you have any comments that you'd like to make?
I was trying to figure out if heat actually transforms things into carbon, because I don't know about that.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you for sharing. That is my son, by the way. Delightful to hear from you, sir.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I think that's one of the clearest times that I've actually understood and been able to put my mind around what this is all about.
Awesome.
It's fantastic.
Good. Thank you, Gracie.
It expresses it. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, it really does, I think. So this first offering called the Olah that we have just read is really, it's wholly consumed by fire, linked with carbon, which is to change its nature and become something completely different. This metaphor of being purged of impurities and now glowing with the light and the heat from the source. That reminds me, and I put a note to myself in my notes as I was studying this week, this is the burning bush. I don't know if you've thought of that. the bush was burning and was not consumed. I don't know if you've ever seen how they make charcoal. If you put something in the fire, it's just going to completely be destroyed and turned into ash. Because the flames of the fire will destroy anything. But to make charcoal, you actually expose it to the heat, and it basically is a process, I believe, of removing all of the moisture from this substance. The flames don't actually touch the object. Fascinating thing. But that's the burning bush. To me, is like the bush is burning, but it's not consumed. It's kind of interesting. So this is bringing the worshiper closer to God, and it lifts him or her up. Now, at the other Hebrew word, and I'm going back to my presentation here for just a moment, ratzon. This is going back to where in just before verse 4, in verse 3, it says that he's doing this, that he may be accepted. And you might be saying to yourself, well, my translation says something similar. Is God not accepting me unless I make this sacrifice? No, that is not a terribly good translation. Excuse me. That's not a terribly good translation. The word ratzon means well-pleasing, delighted, to find favor with God. It does not mean you are not accepted unless you are making this sacrifice. But think about a person who's totally sold out for God, and he wants to get close to God, and he wants to make that connection. He wants to olah, he wants to go up. This is well-pleasing to God. He is delighted. He is finding great favor with God because of his dedicated heart. That is what the word ratzon means. So when you see it, it's saying this person who is making this offering is highly beloved. Is making God delighted. This is making him delighted. Now, you might also be looking at the next Hebrew word in verse 4, which is, it will be accepted, same Hebrew word, ratzon, I'll be delighted to make atonement for him. Now you might say, wait a minute, atonement, that's about covering for sin, isn't it? Not exactly. Not exactly. If you look at the Hebrew word, and I know some of you right now are switching over in your Hebrew interlinear Bibles, and you're looking at that Hebrew word kafar, and I hope that you are, to make atonement, okay, make an atonement for him. Look at what it says just in your Strong's Concordance. This is not even going to a lexicon. Kafar means to cover, to purge, to make atonement, make a reconciliation, or to cover over with pitch. Now we know where that comes from. That's the ark of the Noah's Ark. That this ark was coated with pitch. Now, and I'm not saying necessarily that I would go to the very last possibility of what this word means in Hebrew and just apply that here, but we have no discussion in this section so far at all regarding sin. What does he need to have atoned for? But remember what I said at the very beginning of this presentation. Atonement can also, I like to translate it in English as at one meant, that this sacrifice that you're offering here is making you at one. It is connecting you to God. And I think of, I'm going to go ahead and apply just for a moment the idea of purging and covering over with pitch. Purging, to me, this is a number 2 definition, very, very popular, very common use of this word kafar. To purge something is to cleanse it and remove impurities from it. And I think that there's a case to be made for what this passage might be telling us is that a person whose heart is so desirous of connecting with God, of going up, is going to have his conscience purified, to have his spirit purified? Possibly. Those are two options. I'm not throwing that out there as this is what it means. I'm throwing that out there as an idea that somehow this person with this type of a heart who wants to get that close to God and make that kind of connection with God has some type of a coating applied to him or her that makes them impervious or resistant to outside forces, possibly. That purges them that helps them along in their battle against the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, possibly. It's an interesting idea. But I think there's something to be said for looking at these Hebrew words in this section and really kind of figuring out what is going on here with this person who, when any man of you offers an oblation, what in the heck does that mean? Look at the Hebrew words and dig a little deeper, and you'll find some fascinating things. I'm going to move forward. Does anyone have any comments, questions, or concerns regarding this that we've talked about briefly? Okay, awesome. Thank you guys for sharing those thoughts. I'm going to go forward just a little bit. I promise I don't have much more. I know you guys are probably getting tired. Just a couple more notes that I wanted to share with you. Now, I'm going to just read this section. This is continuing on forward a little bit more. In verse 5, it says, "Then he will slay the bull calf of the herd before Yehovah, and the sons of Aaron, the priests, will bring near the blood and sprinkle the blood against the altar round about, which is at the opening of the tent of appointment. Then he will flay the ascent offering and piece it into its pieces, while the sons of Aaron the priests put fire on the altar and arrange the wood on the fire. The sons of Aaron the priests will arrange the pieces with the head and the suet. I'm sure Jimmy can pipe in and tell us about suet over the wood on the fire which is on the altar, while he shall wash its inwards and its shanks, that is feet, in water. Then the priest will cause the whole of it to fume or go up in smoke on the altar. It is an ascent offering, a fire offering of fragrant odor to Yehovah. If his approach present is from the flock, from the sheep or from the goats, for an ascent offering, a flawless male is it which he shall bring near." Now, I want to point out a couple of things here. Number one is in verse 6, it talks about flaying. That's a weird word that we don't really use much these days. Does anybody know what flaying means?
It's to butcher.
Not quite.
The skin.
It's to remove the skin, yes. To flay something means to remove the skin. So that's an interesting thing, and I think we talked about this a couple of years ago, so I'm not going to go into any great detail on this, but you know that the priests get a portion of certain offerings, not this one obviously, because this is a whole burnt offering, but the skin of this offering is retained by the priests. And I know that you have heard before, and it is true as far as I can find in the first century writings of the Mishnah, regarding the skin of every animal was given to the priests, and that they made Torah scrolls from the skins of these animals. They made other things as well. They could make Torah scrolls, clothing, wineskins, etc., etc. That was part of the offering that always belonged to the priests, except in certain cases, which we'll talk about. But yes, to remove the skin is to flay the skin, so that's just a part of it. And then here's something that's quite interesting. As I began to dig deeper in verse 8, it talks about the sons of Aaron, the priests, arranging the pieces of the head and the suet over the wood on the fire which is on the altar, while he shall wash its inwards and its shanks, its feet, its legs. What's fascinating is what it seemed to be saying is that they're taking the animal apart and then putting it back together again on the altar before they burn it. And I thought, well, how weird is that? Why wouldn't they just kill the animal? I mean, this is a special offering that belongs to God. We don't need to give the skin to Aaron and his sons. Let's just burn the whole thing. Why do we need to slaughter it, pull its skin off, cut it into pieces, and then rearrange the pieces on the altar and then burn it up? It seems terribly weird and potentially wasteful. But then I noted that there's one reason especially that we need to chop this thing apart and then put it back together. How are you going to wash its insides without taking it apart? That seems to be the whole purpose of taking it apart, is to wash its insides. They need to wash the inward parts before putting it back together. And they're also washing its feet. What do you, someone, if you don't have alarm bells going off in your brain right now, it's probably Tracy. Yep, absolutely. That is, I agree with you 100%. And that's definitely what it struck me as when looking at this, is like the whole purpose of this one, at least, but this is happening with several of these animal sacrifices, is taking the animal apart, washing the insides and the feet, and then putting it back together and burning it. I just thought, well, that is a spiritual picture if there ever was one, where you've got the insides need to be washed. And I think of the washing of the Word. I think of our conscience being cleaned, being cleansed of sin, and the feet, washing the feet. You know what that's all about. How you're walking out the commandments of our God. It was a beautiful picture. I'm going to go back to this presentation for just a moment. Now I'm moving forward just a little bit here. In verse 11, it says, "Then he will slay it on the flank, the side of the altar, northward, on the north side of the altar, before Yehovah, and the sons of Aaron, the priests, will sprinkle its blood against the altar round about. He will piece it into its pieces with its head and its insides, and the priest will arrange them over the wood on the fire which is on the altar, and he shall wash the inwards and the shanks in water. Then the priest will bring near the whole and cause it to fume, go up in smoke. On the altar is an scent offering, a fire offering of fragrant odor to Yehovah." Now, something that's and I'm going to bring your attention to a fragrant odor in verse 13. Chazal, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, Chazal, Chazal, is the Hebrew word that means the sages. When the sages talk about the whole sacrificial system, they focus down on this phrase here, a fragrant odor to Yehovah. A pleasing aroma, your text might say. And what they have latched onto, and I think it's a beautiful picture, they're telling us in their words that phrase is keying you in to a profound spiritual truth. When you smell a barbecue, you're not thinking, oh, this is it. This is the substance of it. No, you're thinking that smell is coming from somewhere. Where is it? Because I can smell it. I can smell this. I can smell roasted meat. I love the smell of roasted meat. It's a barbecue. Somebody's having a barbecue somewhere, and I'm excited to go find out where it is. The smell is a spiritual representation of the reality, which is happening on a different spiritual plane, so that these sacrifices of this whole sacrificial system is not what it appears to be. The rabbis of old, for long ago and even today, are telling you this sacrificial system is a shadow picture of something else. It is an odor that is pointing you to the real thing. And I think that we can all agree that as we dig deeper into this and we compare and we contrast the Messiah Yeshua and the sacrifice that he is for us and what he's done for us and what his death does, we'll see these connections and we'll say he is the substance of the fragrant aroma. And the rabbis were keyed in on this long, long ago. They knew this is a mysterious thing. It's highly complicated, highly controversial, very confusing in some cases. So the issue here is this is a shadow picture of something much, much greater. And the rabbis picked up on that from a long time ago. If anybody wants to say anything about that, you certainly can. I'm going to move forward a little bit. And that is that goes way back to some of the Psalms where King David talks about incense being like prayers. So that's a very common thought and a very good one, and I like it very much. Angela, did you want to? Angela's making a note to herself. You know how she is. She's over there in the corner making notes.
Can I just talk without?
You can just talk. Yes, I'm gonna give this microphone. If you hear some rustling of the microphone, I apologize. Go ahead, Angela. Tell us what's up.
The whole thing about the skin just now, I was thinking, the skin is the physical container. That's our outside that contains us. And it's a fragile thing. And I got to thinking about the first sacrifice, and that was when God provided a clothing or a covering or container for Adam and Eve. And that when you built the tent of meeting, which they just finished, there was a fragile curtain around the outside, which I think represents its skin, so to speak. And so when you have these sacrifices that are presented without their skins, Alan was talking about what those skins were used for, and those three things can be seen as containers. You had skins being used to write Torah scrolls, which is a container for the words, the Word of God. You had skins being used to contain wine, and you had skins being made into clothing, which again is a container for the human. And then there's this whole picture of purification with each of those things that, like Tracy said, the Word, we are washed by the Word that purifies us. There's talk of new wineskins in the New Testament, and then there's all kinds of talk about having new clothing. And so I think somewhere in there's a picture of our outer shell and what needs to happen inside.
Thank you, Angela. Delightful and insightful, as always.
First, cleanse the inside of the cup, that the outside may become clean also.
The part that's in contact with the world.
The part that is in contact with the world, just like the foot. Yep. Very good. Very good, you guys. Good stuff. I'm gonna start to wrap up here. I know that we are going a little bit later. You guys hanging in there? Is everybody doing all right?
Yeah.
Okay, good deal. Good deal. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read this little section here. It says, if his ascent offering to Yehovah is from the flyer, that's a bird. This is talking about a poor person who cannot afford one of these larger animals. Then he will bring near turtle doves or dove squabs, young doves, as his approach present. The priest will bring it near to the altar and pinch off its head and cause it to fume on the altar, yet its blood will be wrung out against the side wall of the altar. Then he will take away its craw and its filthy contents and fling it beside the altar eastward at the place for the greasy ash. Yes. And he will cleave it at its wings, yet shall not separate it. Then the priest will cause it to go up in smoke on the altar over the wood which is on the fire. It is an ascent offering, a fire offering of fragrant odor to Yehovah. Now, there's some. I don't have time to go into this, but Angela was picking up on it as I was reading this. This being flung eastward of the altar at the place for the greasy ash. That there's some prophetic language here that I think those of you who are discerning and want to dig a little deeper might be able to dig into that a little bit more. But I just wanted to point out regarding this that this is an indication of our God being accessible to all. That a poor person, and I mean, we saw Yeshua's mother bringing 2 doves at the birth of Yeshua for her own purification and cleansing after the birth of her son, so that he makes himself accessible to all. And that is why I have highlighted here verse 14 being from the flyer. Now I'm going forward just a little bit, and I want to point out just a couple of things. This is from Leviticus 4. This is chapter 4. And this is where we have gone over we haven't dealt with it, but the text has. And the number 1 offering in chapter 1 is the Olah, and then chapter 2 is the Mincha, which is the semolina, the wheat, the grain offering. There's a bunch of details about that in chapter 2, and then number 3 is the I have forgotten the name of it. The Shem. Is it Shamalin? Yes, it's the type of Shalom. Shalamine. There you go. Shalamine. Thank you. But this is going over. This is the first one that is mentioned regarding a sin offering, and that's not exactly a beautiful translation. But nevertheless, I digress, and I'm going to read to you a few little portions of this. Leviticus chapter 4, from 1 to 3, from 13, just part of 13, and then 22. And I want to show you something about this. Leviticus 4:1 starts by saying, Yehovah spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, when a soul sins inadvertently, and that language is definitely in the text. This is not some weird translation that I'm using. It says, when a soul sins inadvertently, accidentally, departing from any of Yehovah's instructions of what should not be done, yet does any of them, if the anointed priest should sin. This first one is if the anointed priest should sin, so as to bring guilt on the people, then he will bring near for his sin with which he has sinned a flawless young bull calf of the herd to Yehovah as a sin offering. Now, if you jump down to verse 13, you've got a different element. It says, if the whole congregation of Israel should make an error, inadvertently, and the matter is obscured from the eyes of the assembly, they're not aware of it, and they do something departing from any of Yehovah's instructions, then there's a different set of instructions for them. And then skipping down to verse 22, it says, when a prince, one of the leaders of your people, sins inadvertently and does something departing from any of the instructions of Yehovah, his God, of what should not be done, and he realizes his guilt. And then if you skip down a little bit further from that, I don't have it on the screen here, but it says, if the normal common person should sin. Now, what you're noticing here, if you dig a little bit deeper, is that there are different perspectives, different ways of doing things for different people or groups of people in the society. The priest, and you can see a couple of different things. For example, the priests can bring sin on the whole congregation by perhaps leading worship in an appropriate way, doing something that the leadership often takes a heavy. Yeshua's brother James tells us the same thing, that let not many of you become teachers because we encourage stricter judgment. This is absolutely true. Look at what happens here with the priest. He's got a certain set of instructions regarding this offering if he himself should sin. The whole congregation has a different set of instructions in case they sin, because, well, I'm going to hold off on the because. The leaders have a different situation, and the individuals have a different situation. There are a couple of very interesting things here. When the priest sins, or when the congregation sins, you'll notice that the blood of the sacrifice is brought inside the tabernacle and is sprinkled in front of the kaporet, that is the separating curtain between the holy and the most holy place. The blood is taken inside the tabernacle and sprinkled before the kaporet 7 times, and it is also placed upon the horns of the altar of incense, but only in the case of the priest sinning or the congregation sinning. If the prince sins, or if an individual sins, then the blood is not taken inside the tabernacle. It is just poured out at the side of around the 4 sides of the altar of burnt offering outside in the courtyard, and is placed upon the horns of that altar, but it is not taken inside the tabernacle. And also note that when a common person sins inadvertently, a female goat is brought. All the other animals are males. There is some very strange and mysterious circumstances here with this first instruction regarding sin offering. Now, does anyone have any comment that they would make regarding anything that I just said regarding these different and disparate elements that seem to be included with the first mention of a sin offering? Any insights or ideas regarding that? There are different Hebrew words used for these animals, and one of the bulls, and I believe it's the one for the priest, is actually indicating a 3-year-old bull, and the other young bull is actually a 1-year-old bull. You'd have to dig into that a little bit deeper, because I think that's quite fascinating as well. And I think, you mentioned previously regarding, there being differences between people, and I would say it's not so much that necessarily as it is that the degree to which people have an influence on those around them. I began to talk about that briefly, where the priest himself has a tremendous impact on the people because he's leading the nation spiritually. The whole people can go off on some weird spiritual tangent and cause the whole congregation. That makes me think of what we read in Exodus chapter 27, I think it is, where it talked about you shall not go after the multitude, because the multitude is almost never right, and the majority never being right. And the mob, absolutely. So that kind of reminds me of the congregation the congregation as a whole has a bigger influence that they can have on everyone. The priest has a bigger influence on everyone's spiritual life. The leader of the people, the prince, not as much. Still fairly powerful individual, but not quite as much. The individual, not nearly as much as the prince. So I think that that's the reason why you see a little bit of this hierarchy of regarding how things are done for individual people groups or persons. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good stuff.
Okay. That's all we have time for this evening, folks. I know it's 9 o'clock, but we haven't seen each other in a couple of weeks, and I'm glad that we were able to reconnect. Now, before we go off and terminate our meeting this evening here, I'm going to pray, and then I'd like to briefly touch base with each of you to just say hello. So begin, if you're near your computer, begin to prepare to unmute yourself after I pray, just so I can say hello and we can hear just a couple of words from you before we wrap up. Normally we have another, hour or so of fellowship time, and I don't want to take too much time here. I want you guys to be able to go off and enjoy yourselves. It would be a little weird to have too many people talking at once on this system. It wouldn't really work. So I just want to take a moment to hear from each of you, if I can, to prepare yourselves to speak. But let us pray together, and then we'll start that. Oh, Heavenly Father, we love you and we thank you for your great care and your great mercy and your great compassion for your people. We do want to ask you, Holy Father, to have mercy on this whole world. We know that there does come a period of irrevocable judgment, and we don't know whether that time is now or whether that time is another. I don't think that any of us feel this, but there could be another several hundred years into the future. But we do ask you, Father, to have mercy on these people, all of them on this planet, our leaders, our friends, our family who may not know you, but most especially your people, whom you have your name placed on them. We just pray that you'll guide and protect and heal and strengthen and encourage all of your people. We love you and we thank you for keeping us safe and giving us life, giving us health and strength and peace. We pray that you will guide us in the coming days to be wise as serpents, yet gentle as doves, to be loving and kind and helpful to the people around us, and to love one another and pray for one another. We thank you for the opportunity to use technology to get together as a group and to discuss, even though we're not physically in the same location. We thank you for the opportunity to do this. Thank you that it worked very well and that we didn't experience any weird, tremendous difficulties with the technology. Thank you so much for that. And I pray that you'll be with all of these people and strengthen them and help them. In the name of our Messiah, Yeshua, amen.